bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Apollo Moon Hoax video. We're going to continue on today with Marcus Allen in the series about his book, The Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence by Marcus Allen, and of course, Trevor Weaver. So hello, Marcus, welcome back.
Hi, Randy. It's great to be back. I think we had a good start to this book. Some very interesting things came out of it, and I hope we'll continue it. And I hope your audience is appreciative of it as well. I look forward to seeing it.
Yes, and I've got some really good feedback on that. And what I'm going to do, I'd like to just explain to the audience actually what I'm doing with these videos. So you notice that we've already talked about, Marcus and I have already discussed the first 4 chapters in his book. And when Marcus and I do a recording, we usually record for about 2 hours. It's usually over about 2 hours. And then what I do is during the editing, what little editing I do, and I'll explain that in a minute, is I like to post it in 30-minute parts, because anything after 30 minutes and you know, people, the attention span is just not there. So I like to do 30 minutes. It works for me too, and it seems to work for everyone else. So you noticed in the last video that I did with Marcus in this series, we did part 1, and I labeled it part 1A, part 1B, and part 1C. Now I'm going to do the same here. This will be part 2. So I'll probably be posting the videos in 2A, 2B, and 2C, 2D if I have to. And that kind of keeps it helps to keep it organized. So what we're going to do now today, and one more point I want to bring up is I don't do a lot of graphic. I don't do any graphics in these videos, as you know, or illustrations. A lot of my time and work is spent writing, researching and writing. So I have a book coming out soon on the JFK assassination, and I'm also working on another book that's in the works. And then there's, of course, one after that. And I'm going to be writing another one with Robin Landry. So a lot of my time is spent researching and writing. So I don't have a lot of time to put into my videos, but I do still like to do the videos because it's a really good backup to the work that I'm doing and the work that people like Marcus Allen are doing. So, but there is another channel, as you well know, the Apollo Detectives channel. And Robert Williams, he does take my videos as well, and he adds a lot of graphics and illustrations, and he's quite good at it. So I will probably post a link to that channel as well, and you can go back and you can view the illustrations. So just to let people know, eventually what I'm going to do is I will get a little bit more in depth when it comes to editing videos and maybe adding some graphics. I know Robin and I, my co-author, and I have talked about that, and we're working on maybe a possible project, but I need to get some other projects out of the way first. I just want to let the viewers know. And I also want to thank all of you for your support and for watching these videos. I've had some really good feedback on my videos with Marcus Allen. And I also post them on BitChute, and I will be posting these videos now soon on Rumble as well. So thank you, everybody, for all the feedback and for all the comments you've made about Marcus and his book. Much appreciated. And so now we're going to continue on. Marcus, if it's okay with you, we continue on with chapter 5.
Yeah, let's do the chapter 5 of the Apollo Moon Hoax, The Real Evidence. Available.
Real Evidence. Yes, that's available on Amazon.com. And the ratings are picking up, so that's good, Marcus. And also a call out to Trevor Weaver, who's also co-author of the book. So thank you, Trevor. So what we'll do now, Marcus, I'm going to start with what we do, of course, just for the viewer to know, all I'm doing is I'm picking 2 salient points, about 2 or 3 salient points from each chapter. And some of the chapters do require illustration. So while I pick the best points where Marcus and I can talk about, because Marcus is really good at explaining this even without the illustrations. So we're going to read a couple of points for each chapter. We'll probably do chapter 5 up to about maybe, we'll see how it goes. We might get to chapter 9 today. So I'm going to read it for the viewer so you'll know where we're coming from, and then Marcus will go more in depth in terms of the details. So Marcus, let's start with chapter 5, or on page 41.
Okay.
Now, we've already touched on this subject, but I just felt it was important to talk about it again, because this is such an interesting subject when it comes to the Apollo missions. I mean, radiation in space, and the Van Allen belts, and the possibility of being caught in a solar flare, a coronal mass ejection, any kind of solar storm. So I really think it's important that we do a little bit more work on this. So
Okay.
I'm looking at page 41, and we'll start in the second paragraph, and this is about Dr. James Van Allen. And for most of you out there, you know who James Van Allen is. For those of you who don't, he was a scientist back in 1958 who discovered the radiation belts surrounding the Earth. So he's a very significant force in this whole subject. So I'll read on here, and then we can chat about it. So second paragraph, Dr. James Van Allen, in a paper published in the Scientific American magazine, warned of the likely dangers of astronauts entering these radiation belts when he said, quote, "Our measurements show that the maximum radiation levels as of 1958 is equivalent to between 10 and 100 roentgens per hour, depending on the still undetermined proportions of protons to electrons." Now, just want to interrupt there. We know that the inner belt is predominantly proton dominated, versus the outer belt, which is electron dominated. So just continue on with his quote. "Since a human being exposed for 2 days for even 10 roentgens would only have an even chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight. Unless some practical way can be found to shield space travelers against the effects of radiation, manned space rockets can best take off through the radiation-free zone over the poles." Now, that is a very loaded statement coming from a scientist, and this is actually published, as I mentioned, in Scientific American. So now you have a scientist back in 1958, James Van Allen, who's produced an article, and it's been peer-reviewed, and it's in Scientific American, and he's basically saying that there's just no way that you can send manned missions through the Van Allen belts directly, or even on the outer edges, safely without killing the crew. He's suggesting going through the North or South Pole. Marcus, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. James Van Allen, after whom the belts are named, of Iowa University, he had theorized the existence of these belts prior to being able to send a Geiger counter up on the first American rocket launched into space, Explorer 1, to confirm them. When he sent the first Geiger counter up on Explorer 1, it started reading. As Geiger counters go, they tick off and they increase the number of ticks depending on the amount of radiation present. Unfortunately, the first rocket sent up, the Geiger counter stopped working. It had been ticking away, and then it suddenly stopped. The implication being that the radiation levels were higher than the Geiger counter had been set to read, hence it stopped. Now, Explorer 4 was the next rocket on which he was able to send a Geiger counter up to measure, and the Geiger counter was set to read at much higher levels, and it started reading considerable levels of radiation where he expected them to be, i.e. in what's known as the inner belt, which starts at about 600 miles above the Earth's surface, goes out to about 3,000, 4,000 miles. Then there's a gap. Then the outer belt starts, goes out to about 25,000 miles. And then radiation doesn't stop at the outer belt, it's radiation all the way to the moon. Hence, James Van Allen, or Dr. James Van Allen's warning that astronauts need to have protection not just for the belts, but throughout space. Space is full of radioactivity. That's what he said. That was his reaction. Space is radioactive. Well, we know that radiation can be harmful to humans. It basically affects our DNA. Hence, we get, if we reproduce, or animals reproduce, or some animals reproduce, if the DNA is affected, it can produce mutations. And on humans, that can be quite unpleasant. So radiation is something that humans need to avoid. And that is the key point. Humans need to avoid it or be protected against it. Just as an aside, if you go to have an X-ray, the technician setting up the equipment and you in an X-ray environment will wear a lead apron to protect himself from the radiation. These are X-rays. X-rays are part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you've got this problem that there is radiation in space. So how do you protect humans from it? Well, the best way to protect humans from it is not to go there in the first place. Or if you're going to insist on going there, you have to have some form of protection. Lead is a very useful method of protecting humans from radiation because it's so dense. And that is how satellites are protected. And unmanned craft are protected against radiation. The electronics in an unmanned satellite is protected from radiation. I know that. I went to a satellite manufacturing facility in the UK and asked them that question. And they said, it's very simple. We encase it in lead. Now, an unmanned craft will be relatively small. So the lead is not an overwhelming weight because lead is heavy, as is water. Water is quite a good protection as well. But if you've got to surround astronauts in a spacecraft with lead, the rocket won't get it off the ground. It's too heavy. So going to Mars, forget it. It's never going to happen. Humans won't be able to get there. Unmanned craft can. This is the difference. Us delicate little creatures, us humans, we need extreme levels of protection. And Concorde, when it was flying, used to fly at about 60,000 feet. It always carried on it a radiation detection meter, not to protect the passengers, but to protect the crew, because they were flying more frequently than the passengers were. And if the radiation levels started to read high, the plane had to either come down or follow a different route. So Concorde was subjected to radiation. So it applies, as you mentioned, solar flares, solar particle events, these totally random outbursts from the sun is what generates the radiation. We need protection from it. Now, there's an interesting parallel story to this whole protection from radiation. It is acknowledged by many people that, as you mentioned in that reference, the best way to avoid the radiation or the Van Allen belts would be to take off through the polar region where the radiation is much less. Because the Van Allen belts are created and controlled and held in place by the Earth's magnetic field. We all know the Earth has a magnetic field. The moon doesn't, so it has no protection. So if you get to the lunar surface, you've got a real problem. You've still got to protect the humans, us delicate little creatures. So many people picked up on this idea of protecting humans and going through the polar regions. And maybe we can come to more detail of that, but you can't fly from Florida to the poles. You can't look, well, you could, but you'll be launching a rocket which may malfunction over considerably populated areas of the east coast of America, which is why all polar flights are launched from California, from Vandenberg Air Force Base. There's nothing below the flight it would take when launched from California that would harm humans on the ground. That's why polar flights are launched from Vandenberg in California. Equatorial flights, we'll call them, are launched from Florida. They go out over Africa and they circle the globe. more or less following the line of the equator. It goes up and down a bit because the equator is not level. The equator is at an angle of 23.5 degrees to the horizontal. So it will follow that, but it's basically an equatorial orbit. If you're going to launch to the moon from an equatorial orbit, you have to fly through the Van Allen radiation belts. You can't help it. Apollo 11, for example, as recorded in the press pack issued to journalists prior to the launch, stated quite categorically that it would launch west of Hawaii to the moon. The translunar injection would take place to the west of Hawaii. Well, that's on the equator, more or less. Spacecraft don't have steering wheels. You're going to go straight ahead at that point, straight through the radiation belts. Now, as soon as this was pointed out to people, as soon as this was mentioned, people agreed that was how it was launched. There had to be some means of overcoming the obvious dangers of radiation in space, which humans are not designed to be protected against. They have to carry their own protection. The spacecraft had no protection. The spacesuits had no protection. So a very involved and rather stupid story was created so that people would believe that astronauts had avoided the belts. Maybe we should come on to that as the next step.
Actually, you're ahead of me. That's exactly what we were going to do. Because NASA inadvertently admits, well, actually, they made a mistake. And I'm going to get to that quote now in a second here. There's a couple of points, though, that I just want to finish up on here.
Yep.
The Geiger counter readings that you had mentioned, they went off the scale. They basically went off the charts. And that reminded me, and that happened a couple of times with back in 1958 when they were sending, as you mentioned, when they're sending up satellites to test the radiation levels. They couldn't test the true readings because the Geiger counter the chart wasn't big enough. That's just to put it in layman terms. That reminds me of Gerald White's interaction with a physicist from Los Alamos who said the same thing. And I put his correspondence in my first book.
Yeah.
When he was saying, the physicist was saying, well, we only know what we know because that's the equipment only allows us to go so far. We really don't know the actual data and the dangers of the Van Allen belts because we don't have the capability of launching the equipment large enough to detect that.
Yeah, good point.
That was, yes. And that really goes along with what you're saying here in your book. The other point I wanted to make was the Concorde. That was a very good point too, Marcus. I was thinking about that. The Concorde actually had to cancel some of its routes occasionally because of the radiation intensity at 60,000 feet, which is very interesting. So some of the polar routes, I guess, they'd have to either fly lower or cancel them outright. They couldn't fly at 60,000 feet. So there were times when it just couldn't do it, which is a very telling. But apparently in low Earth orbit and beyond, it's a walk in the park, you know. But you know, yeah. But leading into now that point you just made, that actually leads me right into the next. So we go to page. Actually, it's 2 pages. We're going to start on page 45. And then I want to go over to page 47. Let's read page 45, the second paragraph, careful analysis. And I want to give a shout out to Armando Balance. He's done some very good work on his YouTube channel. And you mentioned him here in the book. And I want to talk specifically about this because NASA basically inadvertently admits that this was impossible. I mean, even NASA admits that they can't send a manned mission with the protection, the level of protection that they have. They can't send a manned mission through the inner belt. They just can't. It's far too dangerous. NASA actually officially admits that. Okay. This is why your paragraph here is very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So reading on, page 45, careful analysis of the NASA documentation in the Apollo mission reports show the real picture as revealed in these videos from Armando Balance. And for those of you folks out there, please check out his YouTube channel, Armando Balance. He has done some very good work. The NASA documentation provides the precise data from which we can plot the alleged trajectory through the Van Allen radiation belts of all the Apollo spacecraft for each mission. Look at the Apollo 14 trajectory passing through the inner belt as given in the data published by NASA compared with the curved route suggested by Brannick's paper. For those of you out there, I just want to interject here on that. Robert Brannick, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
He posted a paper online years ago showing how safe it would have been for NASA to send Apollo missions through the outer regions of the Van Allen belts. He has since taken that paper down. But if you read through his paper, and I have a copy of that paper, and I talk about that in my book too, is that when you read through that, he does admit that it's a theoretical model. He's not using actual data because he doesn't have actual data to use. And so he's devised a theoretical model, and he spends about a quarter of the paper going after conspiracy theories, which is really unbecoming for a person who calls himself a scientist or a physicist, right? So I just thought I'd throw that in. So Marcus, hold that thought for a second on that paragraph, and let's go to page 47. And we're looking at the third paragraph down. And I want to read that because it really solidifies the paragraph I just read, and then we can discuss it. They have looked at the evidence as well as we have, and they can see that NASA provides detailed data on the routes taken by each of the Apollo missions. Yeah. The truth is that there is no documentation whatsoever in the NASA archive to show that they plotted some trajectory to avoid the Van Allen radiation belts. Contrary to what the pro-NASA groupies disingenuously state, the evidence on this matter rests within the official NASA records. And here's the key. These records show that the Apollo astronauts flew straight through the center of the Van Allen radiation belts. In particular, we would mention the official NASA Apollo 14 final mission report, in which it categorically states on page 148, this is a quote from the NASA document, the translunar injection trajectory lay closer to the plane of the geomagnetic equator than that of previous flights, and therefore the spacecraft traveled through the heart of the trapped radiation belts. That's not Marcus and Trevor talking now. That's a direct quote from NASA in their documents. They're admitting that the radiation, that the Apollo mission, specifically Apollo 14, we'll just focus on that, went through the center of the Van Allen belts. But even NASA itself admits that they can't send any manned missions through that area of the Van Allen belts. So there's a huge, Marcus, a huge contradiction in terms here. Can you talk about that?
It is. It's a considerable contradiction in terms. When NASA made those comments, this would have been back in 1971, Apollo 14, just after the Apollo 13 fiasco, which we've already discussed. If that is on the official NASA records, should we take it as being correct? I think we should. Everybody else seems to. So if they're flying straight through the center of these radiation belts, which we know exist, there's no dispute about their existence. There may be a dispute about the amount of radiation, but the general agreement is that the amount of radiation would be detrimental to human health, us delicate little creatures. Now, at this point, somebody may come up with the Zond 5 flight, which was a Soviet Union flight. It was launched carrying on board 2 tortoises, biological life, seeds, grasses, because the Soviet Union knew perfectly well that there was a danger from radiation. They'd already said it publicly. They weren't trying to hide anything. What they were trying to do was to work out how much there was. So they sent these animals through, and for the first time ever, they were able to get the spacecraft back to Earth in one piece. First time it had ever happened. Prior to any Apollo mission, the Soviet Union could get a craft to the moon, to orbit the moon, which is what Zond 5 did, and then get it back to Earth in one piece. And the tortoises were still alive, obviously a little bit pissed off, a little bit upset, you know, it's a bit bumpy ride coming back to Earth, but they were still alive. Now, what wasn't made clear at the time was that tortoises and turtles and other animals with hard shells, cockroaches come to mind in this case as well, can survive far higher levels of radiation than humans can. We don't have a hard shell. We've got very soft flesh. Tortoises have hard shells. Of course, they were not affected, but the levels of radiation would have been recorded. The Soviet Union would have known perfectly well that America had done similar tests and experiments and would have known the dangers themselves. They actually said, when questioned by Sir Bernard Lovell, who was recording their flights with his Jodrell Bank radio telescope near Manchester in the UK, who went to the Soviet Union quite often to coordinate the efforts that he was making to help them, with the full knowledge of the American and British governments. There's nothing secret about any of that. He asked them, when are you going to send men to the moon? And their reply was straightforward: when we can ensure their safe return due to the dangers of radiation. Notice that was the first thing they mentioned. It wasn't when we can make sure that they land safely because we got to deaccelerate the craft. None of that. The dangers of radiation, that was their prime consideration. So the Soviet Union would certainly have known that the Americans were fully aware of the same dangers to their astronauts as the Soviet Union had identified as being a danger to their cosmonauts. So the idea that humans are affected by radiation is not really in dispute. It's a matter of the level of radiation. And we're always advised that radiation is lethal stuff. Some of it is. But it's noticeable, I think, that the animals left behind when Chernobyl and the 20-kilometer exclusion zone was enacted following the 1986 meltdown of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor, the animals still in that exclusion zone seem to be remarkably healthy in many cases. There are no evidence of mutations or excess deaths. So maybe radiation is not quite the danger that we've been led to believe it is. This was the danger of nuclear radiation, obviously was a byproduct of the Cold War, when nuclear bombs could be dropped on our heads at any minute by anybody, which is a ridiculous thing to even suggest. But that was part of the ramping up of the fear of nuclear warfare generated to encourage the belief that the Soviet Union was a bad person, a bad country. It was all part of the propaganda. There was no evidence for any of it. Yeah. But humans can be affected by radiation. That's not in dispute either. Yeah. So the idea that they had to be protected, or they had to avoid these famous radiation belts by going around the side of them, was something that a lot of people picked up on. And the idea that they were going to avoid the belts became almost a sort of article of faith amongst the believers. Well, if it was so dangerous, these believers would think, there must have been a way around it. So they invented this skirting the belts idea. And you mentioned Robert Bruenig, who published his paper showing how the belts were skirted around, based on no evidence at all, just his own imagination. And it was wrong. The Apollo spacecraft launched straight through the middle of the belts. That's not in dispute. I've mentioned how it was recorded in the Apollo 11 press pack. They launched over the equator near to Hawaii and flew straight out. Spacecraft don't have steering wheels. You can't alter their course unless you deliberately use the rockets, because only rockets will work in space. You can't use wings. They don't work in space. You don't have steering wheels. You don't have brakes. The rocket will go where it's pointed. It was pointed towards the moon's orbit in 3 days' time. That's when they wanted to land. So if they're going to go straight through the belts, and belts are harmful to humans, somebody had to come up with an explanation of how they got to the moon, because they all believed they got to the moon. They didn't, but that's another story. At the time this was going on, they were definitely trying to get to the moon, so they had to avoid the belts. And the story put out by Robert Braunig and supported by several pro-NASA people, Amy Title and Paul Shillitoe, aka Curious Droid, followed on by promoting Robert Braunig's false explanation. We've asked them, having published their names in our book, we've asked them to comment. Did they make a mistake? We've also promised that any comment they do reply to us with will be published in future editions of the book, because it's published print to order.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from